there, my name is Misha Voin, and this is the Eurasian Century. Are we having fun yet? I've put off doing this program for some time now, but events have conspired to move me forward with it. Frankly, up until now, I didn't think that people would believe me as to what I'm about to say about the whole world situation. But obviously, we're witnessing a major transition, and I think people are a little bit more open-minded as to what's transpiring. First order of business is to introduce myself in order to indicate why I might have something useful to say regarding geopolitics. I have a JD, Doctorate of Law, during which I did extensive research into European Union law, and I practiced for a dozen years before going into semi-retirement. Now I work in consulting. I also have degrees in Russian studies and political science, and I speak Russian and Spanish, at least passively. I say this not from pride, but from the perspective that there are those who actually determine the value of someone's opinion based on the letters behind a person's name. That is not my practice. I've heard some very well-educated people say some of the most ridiculous nonsense you can imagine, and I've heard people who have much less education make very wise and insightful observations. But I do think my views may be relevant since I've actually studied some of the issues underlying the current political situation in the world, and you, the readers, or the viewers, will have to decide the value of my contribution for yourselves. I'm not a military expert, and so I'm not going to engage in extensive reporting of details of military developments in the Ukraine or the Middle East or any place really. But I'd rather focus on the political and cultural ramifications, as well as the big picture military scene. What I don't want to do is get bogged down into a lot of details, military details, because I think it's the big picture that actually is more important, not to the people who are actually there doing it necessarily, but from our perspective here at 30,000 feet. Mostly I operate at the geostrategic level, the grand chessboard. I highly recommend Brian Berletic's The New Atlas as a resource for the minutiae of military developments, and also Alexander Mercouris and Alex Christoforou of the Duran. They provide detailed treatment of military developments, as well as the Military Summary Channel, which is another good source. Secondly, I should explain why I'm interested in contributing to the conversation in the realm of independent commentators and analysts. We are at the threshold in world history of something monumental, which does not occur very often. As the name of the program suggests, we are witnessing the rise of a new alliance, independent of the West, wielding tremendous and increasing power at a time of relative Western decline. And so, given my background, I'm sure that my thoughts on the developing situation might be informative to a certain cross-section of the internet viewership. If it's not to your liking, click on. There's a variety of opinion out there. Currently in the West, we are inundated by war-style propaganda. I'll get a little bit into that, why it's that way. But that's on a perpetual basis, we're inundated with it. And it's often difficult to form an accurate picture of what's unfolding from the mainstream media. So you have to go to independent media, alternative media, to get past the official, mostly dishonest narrative. Now, with all of that taken care of, we can get down to cases. The world has gone to war. This may not seem obvious because it is mostly hybrid and asymmetric warfare and proxy warfare. The way you can tell is the degree of propaganda and censorship at the nature and the nature of the economic warfare being waged against perceived enemies. One major indication, besides the censorship in Western countries and the relentless propaganda, is the seizure of central bank reserves by Western powers. This didn't even happen during World War II, and it's been resorted to in the present conflict with dire consequences by the United States. It's probably useful to see the entire matter as a single conflict insofar as the performance of the principal players in one area affects their prowess in other areas. Essentially, the sides are the West versus the rest. The West includes the United States, the EU, Canada, the UK, Australia, and the remaining Anglosphere, Israel, Japan, and South Korea, and perhaps a few other states. They constitute roughly 15% of the population of the world. The rest is everyone else, including Russia, China, the Middle East, sans Israel, India, Africa, Latin America, and most of East Asia. They make up about 85% of the world's population. The West controls much of the world's economic power, but the rest is rising and is controlling an increasing and formidable share of economic power. This does not mean that the entire rest is at war with the West. In fact, the war is really being waged by the West to retain its global hegemony, and the resistance of the rest is, for the most part, they're a part of the conflict. But as it is said, the best defense is a good offense. Currently, Russia is the only great power actively at war with the West. However, the anti-colonial sentiments of most of the rest are moving them to line up with the Sino-Russian alliance, also called the Eurasian Alliance. Shortly before the Ukraine war commenced in earnest in February of 2022, Russia and China concluded a partnership without limits accord. That is, as a practical matter, the declaration of a semi-formal alliance. For several decades, the United States had sought to prevent such an alliance, including the efforts of Henry Kissinger during the Nixon administration to open up China through formal recognition and trade. This was during the Cold War, and an alliance of two powerful communist states was considered a serious menace to the Western world. The Sino-Russian Alliance, or the Eurasian Alliance, brings together the two most powerful countries on the planet next to the United States. Russia is the largest country in the world in terms of geography. Though its current population is only around 150 million, it has the largest nuclear arsenal in the world and a formidable military, as NATO has discovered in the Ukraine to its great chagrin. Since then, that is, since Nixon opened up China, Soviet communism has collapsed, and Russia has become a mixed market economy with both a public and private sector, including a revived spiritual life in its national church. China has morphed into a state which is still officially communist, but with Chinese characteristics. This appears indistinguishable from a mixed market economy controlled by an autocratic elite. Cards on the table. Though I was born in and live in the West, by ethnicity, religious conviction, political conviction, I lean toward the Russian view of these matters. I do try to be honest in reporting and analyzing, but I don't claim to be objective, if that is even possible. I want to give a geostrategic perspective on the unfolding situation, because that is how I think about it and that is the best way to understand the local implications. In order to do this, it's necessary to outline the ideological picture we face. Currently, for the foreseeable future, we have three main worldviews vying for universal dominance. These are liberalism, by that I mean Western liberalism, Christianity, and Islam. Other political powers in the world, such as China, India, and the emerging Latin bloc, the African Union, and the rest, are all regional actors. Liberalism, Christianity, and Islam all claim universal validity and authority. However, as a practical matter at this time, Christianity and Islam are constrained to their respective homelands as regional forces. In fact, Christianity is under great duress and ideological compromise in the West. Thus, liberalism is the sole de facto aspirant to world domination. This phenomenon is synonymous with globalism. The chief proponents of the above-mentioned worldviews are the United States for liberalism, Russia for Christianity, and Saudi Arabia together with Iran for Islam. Liberalism, of course, is the dominant worldview throughout the West. However, there is a segment of the Western populace which holds a Christian or a hybrid Christian worldview as well. By worldview, I mean what the Greeks refer to as phronima, the psychological operating system of the individual consciousness. The mindset. It is not so much a reference to religious observance or political participation as much as the software which the populace runs in its organic computer. It makes assumptions about cosmology, morality, culture, government, and human relations in general. It is your basic context. Most people probably take it for granted to such an extent that they are not even consciously aware that they have one that can be identified as a discrete structure. So these three dominant worldviews are constantly at work in the world. They create the news you see in the media, and they are in conflict with one another. This is complicated by the fact that liberalism in its current late stage has become fascistic in its desperation to survive. By that, I mean it is both an economic hybrid of public and private working together in addition to being totalitarian. Liberals see the state as the end-all be-all and everything else is subservient to the liberal ideology. NATO is the military arm of the liberal empire in Europe, and NATO's proxy regime has been defeated in the Ukraine. Moreover, what is happening right now in the Middle East is uniting the Muslim world and the global South and internally dividing the West. Israel is likely being drawn into a trap in Gaza, a debacle of its own making. Russia is seeking a ceasefire and mediation supported by China and probably BRICS, and Iran is threatening to intervene if Israel invades Gaza. Israel wanted an excuse to clear out Gaza. Be careful what you wish for, you will surely get it. What is the big picture? We are witnessing a world war unfolding. There are at least three focal points of conflict: the Ukraine, Israel, and Taiwan. There may be more to come. The United States and the West, representing the liberal worldview, constitute one side of each of these conflicts, usually by proxy rather than directly. The other side is the Eurasian Alliance and the Global South, representing Christianity, Islam, Confucianism, Hinduism, and others. In short, it's a war of liberal globalism, an ideology, against traditional nationalism of various stripes. Liberalism may be the last major survivor of the ideologies of the Enlightenment, but we'll get back to that. Regarding worldviews, the current conflict centers around the United States and the Russian Federation, the champions of the liberal and Christian worldviews, respectively. The rest of the global South may be accurately seen as allying to a greater or lesser extent with the Sino-Russian alliance. This is relevant inasmuch as it gives the current conflict some of the characteristics of a religious war. Already on the Ukrainian front, the Kievan government has outlawed the canonical Orthodox Church in the Ukraine. In Israel, the IDF has targeted Orthodox Christian churches for airstrikes, including one of the oldest churches in the world, St. Porphyrios, built in the 5th century. Since the Orthodox Christian and liberal worldviews are mutually exclusive regarding many matters, including social mores, this fuels the fervor of the conflict. It also gives Russia an edge in the conflict since much of the world shares its rejection of liberal social values and thus makes natural allies for Moscow, including not only China but the more religious cultures of India, Iran, and Saudi Arabia. Washington paints all of these societies as anti-democratic and repressive in an effort to downplay the social issues and in an attempt to gain the moral high ground. However, this comes at a time when it's become apparent to much of the Western populace that their elites have engaged in a project of manufactured consent, using the mainstream media, academia, and the establishment parties' apparatuses to control and censor the information available to the electorate about unfolding reality in order to direct electoral outcomes in an autocratic fashion. On Ukraine. The Ukraine war really started in February of 2014 with a coup d'etat that overthrew the democratically elected government of Viktor Yanukovych, spearheaded by fascists, all of which were supported by the United States, to the tune of something like $5 billion at least, that we have them on record as having bankrolled the Maidan movement. This was an attack on what has been historically part of the Russian Empire and the former Soviet Union. It had grave security implications for the Russian Federation. NATO had been expanding east against vehement Russian objections for decades, and this was the last straw for Russia. It was apparent that NATO intended to install potential first strike weapons on Ukrainian soil to use as a battering ram, along with the persecution of Russians in eastern Ukraine and other forms of political and economic assault. The Russians started preparing for war while still continuing to seek peace. After dramatic provocations, including the continued efforts to bring Ukraine into NATO, the siege of Russians in the Donbass, and a threat of President Zelensky of the Ukraine to revisit the Budapest Accord, through which Ukraine gave up its nuclear arsenal and renounced any nuclear ambitions, the Russian Federation launched its special military operation in February of 22. Since that time, they have occupied approximately 1/4 of Ukraine's prior territory, if one also counts in the Crimea, which they annexed after the initial coup d'etat. The adversaries there are mismatched, and the only thing keeping Ukrainian forces capable of fighting on is American and European assistance. After Ukraine's counteroffensive, which began in June of this year, after it failed in recent weeks, Russia has resumed the steady acquisition of territory. On Israel, the Israeli conflict is different. It is a real serious contest between extremely powerful forces, the outcome of which is far from certain. The conditions of the Palestinian Arabs in Gaza are appalling. Israelis themselves have referred to it as an open-air prison. The state of Israel actually even rations food allowed into Gaza on a per capita basis to reduce Gazans to below subsistence level consumption. All of that is unconscionable. That is the immediate context of the Hamas attacks on Israelis on October the 7th. Now, there's evidence that Israel actually stood down its defenses along the Gazan border prior to the attack and delayed their own response to the incursion. The Gazan fence is extraordinarily sensitive, with subterranean sensors, surveillance, guard towers, and an extensive technological web to monitor any movement of anything right down to the footsteps of a cat walking along the fence line. The standing down of the security was probably due to internal Israeli political machinations, which are beyond the scope of this program. But I do not believe that the Israelis anticipated the scope or the ferocity of the Hamas attacks. It should be mentioned that in hearings after the 1973 Yom Kippur War, then President Golda Meir admitted that she knew about the planned Arab attacks but rejected preemptive action in order to draw the sympathy of the West in order to ensure the provision of military aid. The transcripts of this testimony were released in 2013. Several events then occurred in rapid succession. Israel had received warnings from Egypt and others of a Hamas buildup toward an attack. Traditionalist Jews in Jerusalem, about 800 of them, supported by the government security, stormed the Temple Mount at the Al-Aqsa Mosque there, provoking the Muslim population. Then, 2 days later, Hamas executed its attack. The attack had been planned for months, possibly years, but Hamas chose the event at the mosque as its triggering event, naming the operation Al-Aqsa Flood. The Hamas attack itself was horrific. You may have seen footage of the slaughter and kidnapping of civilians. There are also fake stories mixed in with the awful details, but that should not distract from the terroristic nature of the acts. However, the really astonishing thing about the attack was how extensive and successful it was. Hamas actually captured some military facilities and personnel during the attack, killing many others. That being said, Israel is not content with hunting down and killing Hamas. It has commenced an indiscriminate bombing campaign of Gaza, dropping an estimated 6,000 bombs in the first 6 days. More Palestinian Arabs have been killed in Israel's reprisals already than the civilians killed by Hamas. Yet Israel stands poised to invade Gaza and engage in urban combat. It has taken a pause during the visit of American President Joe Biden, and it is unclear what its next actions will be, but it presents the appearance that it intends to go in short order. So did Hamas or Iran initiate the second front in the war, or did it Israel and the United States? Hamas may have decided that this was the perfect opportunity to interfere with the emerging Saudi-Israeli rapprochement. The Saudis and the Israelis were working on some form of a peace treaty, which would have been rewarded. The Saudis would have been rewarded by the United States. Hamas may have wanted to bring their struggle to the forefront and torpedo those talks, and in this they may have been egged on by the Iranians. Iran recently formally associated itself with the Eurasian Alliance by joining BRICS. However, it is also possible that the IDF and the Mossad, Israel's CIA, might have baited Hamas into striking at this particular time in order to justify its ethnic cleansing of Gaza and assist the U.S. by diverting attention from the impending calamity in the Ukraine. I would only point out that sometimes both sides have an interest in expanding an emerging conflict for their own respective interests. This is a type of synchronicity of driving forces behind the scenes. Who actually initiates a particular move or expansion simply becomes a matter of time. This may also be the case in Taiwan. What I'm saying basically is that both sides are probably chomping at the bit, and it was only a matter of time. Hezbollah has exchanged fire with Israel from the north and threatens to intervene if Israel invades Gaza. Hezbollah is an agent of Iran, which supports it, and to a lesser extent, Hamas. The United States has sent two carrier groups to the area to deter Iran and Hezbollah from intervening. Russia has MiG-31s deployed over the Black Sea armed with Kinjal hypersonic missiles. Russia and China have taken various measures to propose a ceasefire and negotiations towards a two-state solution, including one Security Council resolution offered by Russia condemning the violence and asking for a ceasefire without mentioning Hamas. That was vetoed by the United States, and since then, Brazil has also offered a resolution condemning the violence, condemning the Hamas attack, and proposing a ceasefire, which was also vetoed, but only by the United States. Part of the task in resolving the situation is containing the conflict to its present participants, which will be very difficult. Iran is one key to the whole dynamic in the Middle East because it is a potential nuclear power, a major military power in the region, and at the same time one of the chief proponents of Islam, being the leader of the Shiite branch. Due to the amount of enriched uranium in its possession, it could assemble a number of nuclear weapons in a matter of days, probably 5 to 10, if compelled by a threat of foreign assault. Iran has secured a clear path directly to Israel through Shiite influence control in Iraq, Syria, and Lebanon along the north. Hezbollah is a proxy of Iran, and Hamas is a recipient of Iranian assistance through Qatar. Hamas is best understood as a spin-off of the Muslim Brotherhood, fostered by Israel to act as a counterweight to the PLO and al-Fatah. In order to prevent the Palestinian Arabs from gaining an independent sovereign state, the Israelis needed a Palestinian entity fundamentally opposed to the two-state solution. Hamas was such an entity, Fatah was not. However, Hamas, because of its origins with the Muslim Brotherhood, is not particularly well liked by Egypt and also by Russia, who have fought some of the same minded people, both in Egypt and Russia has in Syria. Syria, by the way, is another key state in the conflict. Russian forces have aided Syria's president, Bashar al-Assad, in remaining in power against Western-supported Islamic militants. Any strikes against Syria which target the regime or the Russian presence in Syria risk dragging the Russians into the conflict. It is also true of strikes against Iran, which has just joined BRICS. Now, the thing to understand about this conflict is that the polarization exists not only between the West and the rest, but within the West itself. The interesting thing is that public opinion is largely consolidated around the leadership within the Eurasian Alliance and large parts of the Global South. Thus, we see, for example, public opinion having turned against French colonialism in the Sahel and Africa, and Vladimir Putin retaining high popularity ratings within the Russian Federation. However, within the West, there are strong anti-globalist forces at work and increasingly strong illiberal nationalistic forces. I have in mind MAGA, the National Front in France, the Brexit Party, the AfD in Germany, Law and Justice in the Confederation in Poland, and Orban's Fidesz in Hungary. What this actually means is that the liberal West is not only facing the opposition of 85% of the rest of humanity, but a significant share of its own population. A house divided against itself does not have a healthy prognosis. There is a tide in the affairs of men, which taken at the flood leads on to fortune. Omitted, all the voyage of their life is bound in shallows and in mysteries. The conflict with China is a separate animal in that despite all the saber rattling going on in America, the fact is that Europe and America are so interdependent with China economically that actually engaging in a kinetic war with them would probably yield unacceptable economic side effects. I'm not saying that it couldn't happen. I'm not saying the United States doesn't want it to happen. I'm just saying that it's difficult to imagine how it would play out um, given the forces at work in the West. What I believe to be the case is that the American establishment is rhetorically minimizing the Russian problem, to which they have no good answer, by exaggerating the Chinese problem. However, the Ukraine conflict and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict are already ablaze and quite active. Samuel Lubel coined the sun-moon analogy regarding the American political parties back in the early 1950s. This analogy postulated that at any given time, one American political party served as the primary driving political force, and the other operated as a sort of satellite, supporting or opposing to set political boundaries. The analogy can be expanded and applied on the world stage as well when describing the great powers at work now. Since the end of the Cold War, when the Soviet Union effectively collapsed, the United States has enjoyed a period of unipolar dominance on the world stage, up until very recently. But other nations were not sleeping during this period, far from it. Both China and Russia were preparing to defend themselves against the American empire and to maximize their own national potentials in terms of economics as well as military capability. What's really happening, truth be told, is that the primacy of power in our world is shifting so that the U.S. may no longer be the sun power, with others reconciled to being moon powers. Considering its size, its military power, its population, manufacturing power, and lastly, its location spanning across Europe and Asia, the Sino-Russian alliance may instead actually ascend as the sun power. That is why Western elites are freaking out. And it is why they are on full war footing, sparing only the use of nuclear weapons and general mobilization for now. This is a similar transition to that between the British Empire and the United States early in the 20th century. That is the thing which China and Russia are trying to achieve, which, in Xi Jinping's words, has not been done in 100 years. However, the transition between the UK and the US was fairly smooth, insofar as the two are natural allies in English-speaking countries. Primacy is now passing from the United States to the two powers who were its mortal adversaries during the Cold War just over 30 years ago. The character of these two powers has changed dramatically, and the character of the West has deteriorated dramatically. Nonetheless, we are in for a very rough ride. As a little side note, Samuel Huntington, I think it was back in the 90s, wrote a book called The Class of Civilizations, Remaking of the World Order, which is very prescient, looks almost prophetic now in his description of the rise of civilizational states. These are the states that I've been talking about with their respective worldviews, and it wouldn't be a bad idea to consult that book as well as Lubel's work regarding the current conflict. One final note. The fundamental problem in the system is Western liberalism, the philosophy and political mindset that emerged out of the Enlightenment. It twisted and turned with a number of dead ends: Bolshevism, Nazism, Italian fascism, etc. But its final form, secular liberalism, is also a dead end, contrary to what Francis Fukuyama said in his work, The End of History. There is such a thing as real Western culture, but it has been replaced by liberalism. Liberal ideology, for example, has gutted the substance of the Western mainline churches and replaced them with liberal ideology covered by a veneer of Christian terminology. This ideology has resulted in feminism, low birth rates, and the normalization of LGBT practices and culture. These are being rejected by about 85% of the world, and this is a fundamental component, perhaps the fundamental component, of the current conflict. But it is important to realize that this is so not because the rest are coming to destroy the Western garden, as Joseph Borrell, the chief diplomat of the EU, described it, but because the Western garden is pathologically committed to expanding its worldview globally. Hopefully, these little fireside chats will act as beacons of light, along with the contributions of other analysts, commentators, and journalists in the alternative independent media. The Western mainstream media has become a black hole of sorts, from which little, if any, light emanates, and so, in order to avoid unpleasant surprises from developing events, and also to understand what is happening in our world, one must look to more reliable sources in the independent alternative media. And we will close with a touch of culture. От потрясенного Кремля до стен недвижного Китая, стальной щетиною сверкая, не встанет русская земля. Так выселяйтесь к нам войти своих излюбленных сынов. Есть место им в полях России, среди нетуждых им гробов. From the dazed Kremlin to the walls of unmoving China, with their sparkling steel spikes, will not the Russian land arise? So send us those around you, your embittered sons. There is a place for them in the fields of Russia, among the coffins familiar to them. If you enjoy this program, please hit like and subscribe below, and we shall see you next time.